What if the person you thought was just an assistant had actually been running your entire company for 8 years? This is what Alexander Sterling discovered when temporary blindness forced him to truly see for the first time in his life. This extraordinary story of hidden talent, unconscious exploitation, and the power of recognition will completely change how you think about leadership, partnership, and the amazing people who might be working right beside you without getting the credit they deserve. Before we get to this wonderful story, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Now, let's get back to the story. The morning sun cast long shadows across the mahogany-paneled walls of Alexander Sterling's corner office on the 62nd floor of the Sterling Global Tower in Manhattan. At 44, Alexander sat behind his imposing desk like a modern emperor, surveying his domain through floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of the city below. His office was a monument to success. Persian rugs worth more than luxury cars, original artwork that belonged in museums, and walls lined with awards, magazine covers, and photographs of him dining with presidents and celebrities. Alexander Sterling had built Sterling Global Enterprises from a small consulting firm into a $3.6 billion multinational corporation over 15 years. The company now employed over 15,000 people across 4 continents, operated in 12 countries, and held contracts with some of the world's largest governments and corporations. By every external measure, Alexander was a business genius, a visionary leader who had created one of the most successful companies of the 21st century. But success had made Alexander blind in ways he never realized. He had become so convinced of his own indispensability that he couldn't see the forest for the trees. Or more accurately, he couldn't see the extraordinary woman sitting just outside his office who had quietly become the real engine driving his empire. "Good morning, Mr. Sterling," came a warm but professional voice through his intercom. "You have the board meeting at 10, lunch with the Japanese delegation at noon, and the quarterly review with department heads at 3. Also, I've prepared your talking points for each meeting and flagged several items that will need your attention today." Elena Rodriguez had been Alexander's executive assistant for 8 years, and in that time, she had become as much a part of his daily routine as his morning coffee. At 42, Elena possessed an understated elegance that came from quiet confidence rather than flashy display. Her dark hair was always perfectly styled, her professional attire was impeccable without being expensive, and her manner carried the calm authority of someone who knew exactly what she was doing, even if others didn't always recognize it. "Thank you, Elena," Alexander replied, not bothering to look up from the financial reports spread across his desk. "What's the situation with the Henderson merger?" "All documentation is finalized and ready for your signature. I've also prepared a risk assessment analysis highlighting 3 potential concerns that weren't addressed in the original proposal, along with recommended solutions for each." Alexander finally glanced up, slightly annoyed. "Elena, I don't need analysis from you. I need documents organized and meetings scheduled." Elena's expression didn't change, but Alexander missed the slight tightening around her eyes. "Of course, Mr. Sterling, I'll focus on administrative tasks." What Alexander didn't know was that Elena's administrative tasks included coordinating with 12 department heads, managing crisis communications with 3 international offices, reviewing legal documents that would determine the success or failure of multi-million-dollar deals, and serving as the unofficial strategic advisor to executives throughout the company. While Alexander saw himself as the brilliant leader making all the important decisions, Elena was actually the central nervous system that kept Sterling Global functioning. After Elena left his office, Alexander returned to reviewing the quarterly reports, taking satisfaction in the impressive numbers that reflected his company's continued growth. Revenue was up 23% from the previous year. Profit margins had improved across all divisions, and their expansion into Asian markets was exceeding all projections. Alexander felt the familiar pride that came with being recognized as one of the most successful CEOs in America. What he didn't realize was that many of the strategic initiatives he was taking credit for had actually been developed by Elena. The Asian expansion strategy. Elena had spent 6 months researching market conditions, regulatory requirements, and cultural considerations before presenting her findings to Alexander as background information for his decision-making. The improved profit margins? Elena had identified inefficiencies in their supply chain and coordinated with operations managers to implement solutions that Alexander had approved without really understanding. Around 9:30, Elena knocked on his office door and entered carrying a thick folder and her ever-present tablet. "Mr. Sterling, here are your materials for the board meeting. I've included detailed financial projections, market analysis data, and responses to the questions that Director Morrison is likely to ask based on his previous concerns about the European expansion." Alexander took the folder without really looking at it. "Fine. Also, Elena, I need you to call Senator Williams' office and set up a meeting about the infrastructure contract. Make sure they understand that Sterling Global is the obvious choice for this project." "I'll handle that immediately. Also, there are 3 urgent items that need your attention before the board meeting." "What items?" Elena consulted her tablet. "First, the Mumbai office is reporting equipment failures that could shut down production for up to 2 weeks. They need approval for emergency equipment purchases. Second, our legal team needs a decision on the Morrison contract dispute. Their lawyers are threatening to terminate the agreement unless we resolve the liability issues by end of business today. Third, the PR department needs your approval on our response to the environmental lawsuit filed by the Clean Water Coalition." Alexander felt a familiar irritation. Why did everyone always come to him with problems? Couldn't people handle anything themselves? "Elena, you deal with the Mumbai situation. Just approve whatever they need. For the Morrison contract, set up a meeting with legal for next week and tell PR to handle the environmental thing however they think best." Elena made notes on her tablet, hiding her frustration. The Mumbai situation required a $2.3 million equipment purchase that would impact quarterly budgets. The Morrison contract was worth $85 million, and the dispute could cost them the entire deal if not resolved immediately. The environmental lawsuit could result in $50 million in penalties if not handled properly. These weren't minor administrative issues. They were major strategic decisions that would affect the company's future. But Elena had learned over 8 years that Alexander didn't want to be bothered with the actual work of running the company. He wanted to focus on the glamorous aspects: board meetings, media interviews, conference speeches, and networking with other powerful people. The day-to-day operations, crisis management, and detailed decision-making were things he delegated to others, primarily to Elena, while taking credit for the positive outcomes. "Of course, Mr. Sterling, I'll handle everything." After Elena left, Alexander spent the next 20 minutes preparing for the board meeting by reviewing the materials Elena had prepared. The financial projections were thorough and impressive, the market analysis was comprehensive and insightful, and the strategic recommendations were brilliant and well-reasoned. Alexander felt confident and prepared, never questioning where these materials had come from or how much work had gone into creating them. Meanwhile, in her office just outside Alexander's door, Elena was simultaneously coordinating the Mumbai equipment purchase, arranging an emergency conference call with the Morrison contract legal team, drafting a response to the environmental lawsuit, and preparing backup materials for the board meeting in case any unexpected questions arose. Her phone rang constantly throughout the morning. Department heads calling for guidance, international offices reporting on overnight developments, vendors needing approval for major purchases, and legal teams seeking strategic direction. Elena handled each call with competence and authority, making decisions that affected millions of dollars and thousands of employees. "Elena, it's David from legal," came a voice through her headset. "The Morrison people are being completely unreasonable about the liability clauses. They want us to assume full responsibility for any environmental impact, which could cost us tens of millions if something goes wrong." Elena pulled up the Morrison contract files on her computer while continuing to review the Mumbai equipment specifications on her tablet. "David, what's their real concern? Are they worried about actual environmental damage, or are they trying to shift financial risk? Based on their language, I think they're mostly concerned about regulatory compliance costs. The EPA has been cracking down on companies in their industry, and they don't want to be liable for expensive remediation if environmental standards change." Elena quickly analyzed the situation. Sterling Global had environmental insurance that would cover most potential issues, and their manufacturing processes were already exceeding current EPA standards by significant margins. David, offer them a compromise. We'll accept liability for environmental impact caused by our manufacturing processes, but only up to $10 million per incident, and only for incidents that exceed our current compliance standards. In exchange, they accept our standard delivery timeline and penalty structure. Elena, that's actually brilliant. That gives them the protection they want while limiting our exposure to manageable levels. Call me after you present it to them. If they accept, we can finalize everything today. Elena hung up and immediately switched to her next crisis. The Mumbai equipment failure was more serious than initially reported, not just a single machine breakdown, but a systemic failure of their primary production line that could affect their ability to fulfill contracts with 3 major clients. She quickly calculated the financial impact. 2 weeks of downtime would cost $8.2 million in lost production, plus potential penalty payments to clients for delivery delays. The emergency equipment replacement would cost $2.3 million, but could get them back online within 5 days, reducing the total impact to $3.1 million. Elena approved the equipment purchase immediately and then called the Mumbai facility manager to coordinate the installation timeline. She also contacted their 3 major clients to explain the situation and negotiate temporary extensions on delivery schedules, using her knowledge of their business relationships and contract terms to minimize penalties. Within 2 hours, Elena had saved Sterling Global approximately $5 million in potential losses, secured an $85 million contract that was about to be canceled, and prevented an environmental lawsuit that could have cost $50 million in penalties. Alexander knew about none of this. At 9:55, Elena knocked on Alexander's office door. "Mr. Sterling, the board members are arriving. Are you ready?" Alexander straightened his tie and checked his appearance in the mirror behind his desk. "Of course. Let's go show them how Sterling Global continues to lead the industry." As they walked toward the boardroom, Alexander felt the familiar confidence that came with success. He was about to present another quarter of exceptional performance to his board of directors, demonstrating once again why he was considered one of the most capable CEOs in America. Elena walked slightly behind him, carrying the materials that would make his presentation possible, hiding her knowledge that almost everything he was about to take credit for had actually been accomplished by her and the team of talented people she coordinated throughout the company. The Sterling Global boardroom was a monument to corporate power. A mahogany table that could seat 20 people, leather chairs that cost more than most people's cars, and walls lined with screens displaying real-time financial data from around the world. Alexander took his place at the head of the table, exuding the confidence of a leader who believed he had earned his position through superior capability and vision. The 8 board members filed into the room, representing some of the most successful business leaders in America. There was Margaret Chen, former CEO of Pacific Industries, David Morrison, who had built 3 companies from startup to billion-dollar valuations, Patricia Williams, the legendary investor who had never made a bad deal, and 5 others who collectively controlled hundreds of billions in assets. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alexander began, opening the folder Elena had prepared, "I'm pleased to present another quarter of exceptional performance that demonstrates Sterling Global's continued market leadership." For the next 30 minutes, Alexander presented financial results, strategic initiatives, and future projections with the polished confidence of a seasoned executive. Revenue growth of 23%, profit margin improvements across all divisions, successful expansion into 3 new international markets, and positive projections for the coming year. "Alexander," said Director Morrison, "these results are impressive, but I have questions about the operational details. How are you managing the supply chain disruptions that have been affecting our industry?" Alexander glanced quickly at his notes, finding Elena's prepared response. "We've implemented a diversified supplier strategy that reduces our dependence on single-source vendors while maintaining quality standards and cost efficiency." What Alexander didn't mention was that this strategy had been developed entirely by Elena after she identified vulnerabilities in their supply chain 6 months earlier. She had researched alternative suppliers, negotiated new contracts, and coordinated the transition with operations managers across 4 countries. Alexander had simply approved her recommendation without understanding the complexity of what she had accomplished. "What about the environmental compliance issues that have been challenging other companies in our sector?" asked Director Chen. Again, Alexander consulted Elena's notes. "We've exceeded EPA standards by 40% across all our facilities and have implemented proactive monitoring systems that identify potential issues before they become compliance problems." Elena, sitting quietly in the corner taking notes, knew that Alexander had no idea how their environmental compliance actually worked. She had spent months working with facility managers, environmental consultants, and legal teams to develop their compliance strategy. She monitored regulatory changes, coordinated upgrades to equipment and processes, and maintained relationships with environmental agencies. Alexander's role had been limited to signing checks for the necessary investments. Director Williams raised a concern that wasn't in Elena's prepared notes. "Alexander, I've been hearing rumors about workforce dissatisfaction in our international offices. There was mention of potential unionization efforts in the European facilities. How are you addressing these issues?" Alexander felt a moment of panic. This wasn't something he had prepared for, and he had no idea what the actual situation was in their European offices. He glanced toward Elena, hoping for some guidance. Elena discreetly made a note on her tablet and showed it to Alexander. "Proactive engagement with employee representatives, addressed concerns through improved benefits, package and communication protocols. Unionization discussions have decreased significantly." Alexander read from Elena's note. "We've taken a proactive approach to employee relations in all our international facilities. We've engaged directly with employee representatives to address concerns and have implemented improved benefits, packages, and communication protocols. As a result, discussions about unionization have decreased significantly." Director Williams nodded approvingly. "Excellent. Proactive employee relations are crucial for long-term success." What Director Williams didn't know was that Elena had personally flown to London, Berlin, and Frankfurt over the past 3 months to meet with employee representatives, facility managers, and local labor officials. She had identified the specific concerns driving unionization discussions, primarily related to healthcare benefits and career advancement opportunities, and had developed solutions that addressed these issues while remaining within budget constraints. Elena had negotiated with insurance providers to improve healthcare coverage, worked with HR to create clearer promotion pathways, and established regular communication channels between management and employees. The improved employee relations were entirely due to her efforts, but Alexander was taking credit for work he didn't even know had been done. The board meeting continued for another hour, with Alexander fielding questions about market strategy, competitive positioning, and future growth plans. Each time, he relied on the materials Elena had prepared, presenting her analysis and recommendations as his own strategic thinking. "Alexander," said Director Morrison as the meeting concluded, "I have to say that your operational management has improved significantly over the past 2 years. The level of detail in your analysis and the sophistication of your strategic planning are impressive." Alexander smiled proudly. "Thank you, David. I believe in staying closely involved in all aspects of the business." Elena kept her expression neutral, but internally she felt a familiar mixture of frustration and resignation. Over the past 2 years, she had essentially been serving as an unofficial chief operating officer, while Alexander focused on the external aspects of being CEO. She had developed most of the strategies Director Morrison was praising, solved most of the operational challenges that had improved their performance, and managed most of the detailed execution that had led to their success. After the board members left, Alexander returned to his office feeling energized and successful. Another excellent board meeting, another demonstration of his leadership capabilities, another confirmation that he was indeed the irreplaceable genius behind Sterling Global's success. "Elena," he called through his intercom, "excellent preparation for that meeting. Your administrative support made everything run smoothly." Elena stared at her computer screen for a moment before responding. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling. I'm glad the materials were helpful." What Elena wanted to say was that the materials, represented hundreds of hours of analysis, research, coordination, and strategic thinking. She wanted to point out that the success Alexander was taking credit for was actually the result of her managing complex operations that he barely understood. But she had learned over 8 years that Alexander didn't want to hear about the actual work that went into running Sterling Global. He wanted to maintain the illusion that his natural brilliance and leadership ability were sufficient to manage a $3.6 billion corporation. The afternoon brought a steady stream of challenges that reinforced Elena's central role in keeping Sterling Global functioning. A crisis in their Shanghai facility required immediate attention. A supplier had failed to deliver critical components, threatening to shut down production for their biggest client. Elena spent 2 hours coordinating with procurement managers, alternative suppliers, and logistics coordinators to arrange emergency shipments that would keep the production line running. A regulatory issue in their London office needed immediate resolution. New financial reporting requirements had been implemented by the UK government, and their compliance officer was unclear about how to implement the changes. Elena researched the new regulations, consulted with their legal team, and developed an implementation plan that would ensure compliance while minimizing operational disruption. A personnel crisis in their Chicago facility demanded urgent attention. Their facility manager had resigned unexpectedly, leaving a leadership vacuum that was affecting productivity and morale. Elena coordinated with HR to identify interim management, worked with operations to maintain production schedules, and initiated recruitment for a permanent replacement. Each of these crises could have significantly impacted Sterling Global's performance if not handled quickly and competently. Elena resolved all three before the end of the business day, making decisions that affected millions of dollars and hundreds of employees. Alexander knew about none of it. At 6 p.m., Elena knocked on Alexander's office door for their daily briefing. "Mr. Sterling, here's your summary of today's activities and tomorrow's schedule." Alexander looked up from his computer, where he had been reading online articles about himself and the company's recent success. "Go ahead." Elena consulted her tablet. "The Mumbai equipment issue has been resolved with minimal production impact. The Morrison contract has been finalized with terms favorable to our interests. The environmental lawsuit has been settled with no admission of liability and minimal financial impact. Tomorrow you have breakfast with Senator Williams about the infrastructure contract, the quarterly review with international operations, and the strategy session for the Henderson merger." Alexander nodded absently. "Good work on coordinating everything. What about the Henderson merger? Are we on track?" Elena had been managing the Henderson merger for 6 months, coordinating due diligence, negotiating terms, and managing the complex integration planning that would be required if the deal went through. "All documentation is ready for final review. The legal teams have resolved the remaining issues, and we're positioned to close within the projected timeline." "Excellent. Elena, this Henderson acquisition is going to be a major achievement for Sterling Global. It will demonstrate our continued growth and market leadership." Elena nodded professionally, though she knew that the Henderson acquisition was primarily her achievement. She had identified Henderson Industries as an ideal acquisition target, conducted the initial financial analysis, developed the acquisition strategy, and managed almost every aspect of the negotiation process. Alexander's involvement had been limited to attending a few high-level meetings and signing documents. "Will there be anything else, Mr. Sterling?" "That's all for today. Good work." Elena gathered her materials and returned to her office, where she would spend another 2 hours preparing for tomorrow's meetings, reviewing international reports that had come in after business hours, and coordinating with facility managers in different time zones. Her day started before Alexander arrived and ended long after he left, yet he was the one who received recognition for the company's success. As Elena worked late into the evening, she reflected on the strange situation she found herself in. She had an MBA from Wharton, 8 years of experience essentially running a multinational corporation, and a track record of success that would qualify her for CEO positions at smaller companies. Yet, she remained in a role officially designated as executive assistant, watching someone else take credit for her work while receiving a fraction of the compensation and recognition she had earned. Why did she stay? The question haunted Elena sometimes. particularly on nights like this when the inequity of her situation felt especially sharp. Part of it was practical. She was well compensated for an assistant, even if underpaid for the work she actually did. Part of it was professional satisfaction. She genuinely enjoyed the challenge of managing complex operations and solving difficult problems. But mostly, Elena stayed because she believed in Sterling Global and the people who worked there. The company employed over 15,000 people whose livelihoods depended on its continued success. Elena knew that her work, even if unrecognized, was essential to maintaining that success and protecting those jobs. However, Elena was about to discover that sometimes the universe has a way of forcing recognition when people are too blind to see what's right in front of them. 3 weeks later, Alexander sat in the waiting room of Dr. Patricia Hoffman's ophthalmology practice, impatiently checking his phone and wondering why he had waited so long to address the vision problems that had been bothering him for months. The headaches, blurred vision, and difficulty focusing had become increasingly severe, but Alexander had been too busy, or too stubborn, to take time for medical appointments. Dr. Hoffman was one of the most respected eye surgeons in New York, and Alexander had used his connections to get an emergency appointment when his symptoms had suddenly worsened over the weekend. Now, after a comprehensive examination that had taken 2 hours, he was waiting for results that would change his life in ways he couldn't imagine. "Mr. Sterling," Dr. Hoffman said, entering the consultation room with a serious expression, "I need to discuss some concerning findings from your examination." Alexander felt a chill of anxiety. "How concerning?" "You have a severe retinal detachment in your left eye that requires immediate surgical intervention. If we don't operate within the next 24 hours, you could lose vision in that eye permanently. Additionally, you have developing cataracts in both eyes that are contributing to your vision problems." Alexander felt as if the ground was shifting beneath him. How is that possible? I've never had eye problems before. These conditions can develop gradually without obvious symptoms until they reach a critical stage. The retinal detachment appears to be related to high blood pressure and stress, both of which can be occupational hazards for executives in high-pressure positions. "How long will the recovery take?" Dr. Hoffman consulted her notes. "The surgery itself takes about 2 hours, but the recovery process is more complex. We'll need to keep both eyes bandaged for 72 hours minimum to prevent complications. After the bandages are removed, your vision will be significantly impaired for at least a week, possibly longer." Alexander felt panic rising in his chest. Significantly impaired how? "You'll be functionally blind for approximately 7 to 10 days. You'll be able to perceive light in basic shapes, but you won't be able to read, use computers, drive, or perform most normal activities. Your eyes will need time to heal and adjust to the surgical changes." "That's impossible," Alexander said flatly. "I'm the CEO of a $3.6 billion corporation. I have board meetings, investor conferences, merger negotiations, international travel. I can't be blind for 10 days. Dr. Hoffman's expression remained professional, but firm. "Mr. Sterling, if we don't perform this surgery immediately, you could be permanently blind in your left eye. The retinal detachment is progressive and has already caused significant vision loss that may not be fully recoverable." Alexander felt trapped between two impossible choices. He couldn't afford to lose his vision permanently, but he also couldn't imagine how Sterling Global could function without his direct oversight for more than a week. In his mind, the company's continued success depended entirely on his constant management and decision-making. "Doctor, isn't there any way to accelerate the recovery process? I have critical business obligations that can't be postponed." "I'm afraid not. Any attempt to rush the healing process could result in complications that might require additional surgeries or could cause permanent damage. Your vision and your long-term health have to be the priority." That evening, Alexander sat in his apartment overlooking Central Park, staring out at the city lights that seemed to blur and shift as his damaged vision struggled to focus. For the first time in his adult life, he was facing a situation that he couldn't control, couldn't delegate, and couldn't solve through determination and intelligence. He called Elena at home, something he rarely did except for genuine emergencies. "Mr. Sterling?" Elena's voice carried concern. "Is everything all right?" Elena, I need you to clear my schedule for the next 2 weeks. I'm having emergency eye surgery tomorrow and I'll be unable to work for about 10 days. There was a pause before Elena responded. Is it serious? Are you going to be all right? Alexander appreciated her genuine concern, though he was too focused on business implications to recognize it fully. The surgery should be successful, but I'll be temporarily blind while my eyes heal. Elena, this couldn't come at a worse time. We have the Henderson merger closing next week, the quarterly investor conference, the government contract proposal, and the European expansion planning meetings. Mr. Sterling, don't worry about any of that. Your health is the most important thing. I can handle postponing whatever needs to be postponed and managing whatever can't wait. Elena, the Henderson merger alone is worth $400 million. If we miss the closing deadline, we could lose the entire deal. Their board is already concerned about our commitment level. Elena was quiet for a moment, and Alexander could hear her thinking through the implications. Mr. Sterling, if I may suggest, I'm familiar with all the details of the Henderson merger. I've been managing the due diligence process and coordinating with their team throughout the negotiation. I could handle the closing process as your representative. Alexander felt uncomfortable with the idea. Elena, this is a $400 million acquisition. It requires executive-level decision-making and authority that goes far beyond administrative support. Of course, Elena replied carefully. I would be acting strictly as your proxy, following the parameters you've established and consulting with you on any major decisions. I wouldn't make any commitments outside of the agreed framework. Alexander realized he had few alternatives. Postponing the Henderson merger would likely kill the deal entirely, and he couldn't trust anyone else to manage something so critical to Sterling Global's future. Fine, he said reluctantly. But Elena, you need to run every single decision by me before making any commitments. Every contract clause, every financial term, every timeline adjustment, everything goes through me first. Absolutely, Mr. Sterling. I'll make sure you're informed and consulted on every aspect of the process. What Alexander didn't know was that Elena had essentially been running the Henderson merger for months. She had developed the acquisition strategy, identified the key negotiation points, built relationships with Henderson's management team, and managed almost every aspect of the due diligence process. Alexander had been signing documents and attending high-level meetings, but Elena had been doing the actual work of making the merger happen. After hanging up, Alexander spent the rest of the evening trying to figure out how to maintain control of his company while being unable to see. He could use voice recognition software for emails, conduct meetings by phone, and rely on Elena to read documents to him. It would be inconvenient and frustrating, but he was confident he could continue managing Sterling Global's operations from his apartment. Alexander had no idea that he was about to discover just how much of Sterling Global's success depended on the woman he had consistently underestimated and undervalued. The eye surgery took place at Mount Sinai Hospital at 7 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. Alexander was unconscious for the procedure, but when he woke up 3 hours later with thick bandages covering both eyes, the reality of his situation hit him with overwhelming force. For the first time since childhood, he was completely helpless and dependent on others for even the most basic needs. Mr. Sterling, Elena's familiar voice came from somewhere to his right. How are you feeling? Like I'm trapped in a nightmare, Alexander replied honestly, his voice hoarse from the anesthesia. Elena, please tell me there's some way to remove these bandages early. Dr. Hoffman was very specific about the 72-hour minimum healing time. But don't worry. I've arranged for everything to continue running smoothly while you recover. I'll be coordinating all business activities and keeping you informed of everything that needs your attention. Over the next 3 days, Alexander experienced a level of helplessness and dependency that he had never imagined possible. He couldn't read emails, couldn't see who was calling him, couldn't review documents, couldn't navigate his own apartment without assistance, and couldn't perform any of the activities that had defined his identity as a powerful, independent leader. Elena visited twice daily, updating him on business developments and reading him the most critical documents and communications. But even these briefings felt surreal and disconnected to Alexander. Without being able to see financial reports, read contracts, or observe the body language and expressions of the people he was dealing with. He felt like he was trying to run a company through a narrow keyhole. "Elena," Alexander said during her Wednesday evening visit, "what's the status of the Morrison contract situation?" "I spoke with their legal team this morning. They had concerns about the liability clauses, but I was able to work out a compromise that addresses their issues while protecting our interests. The contract is now finalized and ready for execution." Alexander felt a mixture of relief and unease. "You worked out a compromise?" "Elena, that's a $50 million contract. You should have consulted with me before making any agreements." "Mr. Sterling, you authorized me to handle operational issues, and the compromise I negotiated follows the same liability structure we've used successfully in similar contracts. I felt confident that it was within the parameters you would approve." Alexander wanted to argue, but he realized that Elena was probably right. Without being able to see the actual contract terms or participate in the negotiations, he had no basis for questioning her judgment. The uncomfortable truth was that he was completely dependent on Elena's competence and decision-making ability. "What about the Shanghai facility crisis?" "Resolved. I approved emergency equipment purchases that got the production line back online within 48 hours. The total cost was $2.1 million, but we avoided approximately $8 million in lost production and contract penalties." Again, Alexander felt the strange combination of gratitude and anxiety that came with being completely dependent on someone else's judgment. Elena had made a $2.1 million decision without consulting him, but she'd apparently saved the company much more than that amount. Thursday brought news that made Alexander's situation even more challenging. Elena arrived at his apartment with an update that sent his stress levels soaring. "Mr. Sterling, I have some concerning news about the Henderson merger. James Henderson called this morning to say that their board is getting nervous about the delayed closing. They're starting to question whether Sterling Global is fully committed to the acquisition." Alexander felt panic rising. "Elena, we can't lose this deal. Call Henderson immediately and assure him that we're completely committed. Set up a conference call so I can speak with him directly." "I already spoke with him for an hour this morning. I explained your medical situation and assured him that Sterling Global remains fully committed to the merger. I also provided him with updated financial projections and timeline confirmations." "What did he say?" Elena hesitated before responding. "He said he was impressed with my knowledge of the deal structure and my understanding of the integration planning. He also mentioned that he's been more comfortable working with me than with some of the other executives he's dealt with in previous acquisitions." Alexander felt a complex mix of emotions. He was relieved that Henderson was satisfied with Elena's management of the situation, but he was also disturbed by the implication that his assistant was successfully handling negotiations that should require CEO-level authority and expertise. "Elena, how much does Henderson know about the actual work you've been doing on this merger?" There was a longer pause before Elena answered. "Mr. Sterling, James Henderson and his team have been working primarily with me for the past 4 months. They know that I coordinate the due diligence process, manage the integration planning, and serve as the primary point of contact for operational details." Alexander felt as if the ground was shifting beneath him again. "Elena, are you telling me that Henderson considers you his primary contact for a $400 million acquisition?" "I would say that Henderson's team works with me on the detailed implementation while recognizing that you provide the strategic direction and final authority." Even in his current helpless state, Alexander could sense that Elena was being diplomatic. The reality seemed to be that Henderson's team had been working primarily with Elena throughout the merger process, and that they had more confidence in her management of the deal than they might have in his. On Friday, when Dr. Hoffman finally removed the bandages from Alexander's eyes, his relief was short-lived. His vision was so blurry and light-sensitive that he could barely distinguish shapes and shadows. Dr. Hoffman had warned him that this was normal, but experiencing it was far worse than he had anticipated. "Elena," Alexander said, squinting painfully at what he thought was her silhouette. "I can't see anything clearly. How am I supposed to review documents or participate in meetings?" "Dr. Hoffman said your vision will gradually improve over the next week. In the meantime, I can serve as your eyes for reading documents and describing visual information. We can also set up audio conferencing for any meetings that can't be postponed. Alexander felt completely vulnerable and dependent. For the first time in his adult life, he couldn't function independently, and his entire professional identity was built around being in control and making informed decisions. Elena, I need you to read me the Henderson merger documents. I want to review every clause and term before we proceed. For the next 2 hours, Elena read through hundreds of pages of legal documents, financial projections, and integration plans. As she read, Alexander began to notice something that both impressed and disturbed him. Elena wasn't just reading, she was interpreting, analyzing, and providing context that demonstrated a level of understanding that went far beyond administrative support. The purchase price adjustment clause provides for post-closing modifications based on working capital variations, Elena read. However, the calculation methodology could be problematic if Henderson's accounts receivable collection patterns change significantly between now and closing. We might want to consider adding a collar provision that limits the adjustment range. Alexander stopped her. Elena, how do you know about collar provisions and working capital adjustments? There was a slight pause before Elena responded. I researched the technical aspects of our major transactions to better understand the documents I'm coordinating. But Elena, collar provisions are sophisticated financial instruments that most executives don't fully understand. Where did you learn about them? I studied them as part of understanding our acquisition processes. Alexander was beginning to suspect that Elena's knowledge and capabilities were far more extensive than he had ever realized. Over the following days, as his dependence on her continued, he would discover just how much he had been underestimating the woman he had classified as just an assistant. By Monday morning, Alexander's vision had improved enough that he could navigate his apartment and distinguish faces, but he still couldn't read text clearly or focus on detailed visual information. Elena arrived at 8 a.m. to escort him to the office, something that would have been unthinkable a week earlier, but now felt essential for his ability to function professionally. Mr. Sterling, Elena said as they entered the Sterling Global building, I should mention that the Henderson merger closing has been rescheduled for today. Their legal team will be here at 2 p.m. and all the documentation is ready for final execution. Alexander felt a surge of anxiety. Today? Elena, I can barely see well enough to read contracts. How am I supposed to negotiate final terms when I can't even review the documents? All the major terms have been negotiated and agreed upon. Today's meeting is primarily about signing documents and finalizing the procedural details. I can guide you through anything you need to review, and I'll be there to provide any information or clarification you need. As they entered the building, Alexander was struck by how many employees greeted Elena personally and asked about her weekend, her family, and her recent projects. She seemed to know details about their work, their challenges, and their personal lives in ways that suggested ongoing relationships rather than casual interactions. Elena, Alexander said as they waited for the elevator, how well do you know the other employees? I work with most of the department heads and senior managers on a regular basis. I also try to stay informed about what's happening throughout the company. What Elena didn't mention was that many of the employees considered her more approachable and knowledgeable than Alexander. While he maintained an intimidating distance from everyone except senior executives, Elena had built relationships throughout the organization that allowed her to coordinate activities, solve problems, and maintain the communication networks that kept Sterling Global functioning effectively. When they reached the executive floor, Alexander was surprised to see a line of people waiting outside Elena's office rather than his own. Department heads, managers, and senior staff members were seeking meetings with Elena, not with the CEO. Elena, said Marcus Williams from International Operations, I need to discuss the supply chain modifications for the Asian markets. Do you have a few minutes this morning? Of course, Marcus. Let me get Mr. Sterling settled, and then we can review the current status and projected timelines. Also, added Jennifer Park from Legal, the environmental compliance audit results came back, and there are 3 issues that need immediate attention. Elena made notes on her tablet. I'll review the audit findings and coordinate with the facility managers to develop response plans. Can you have the detailed report on my desk by noon?" Alexander watched this interaction with growing confusion. These were senior executives seeking guidance and direction from his assistant, and Elena was responding with the authority and knowledge of someone in a management position. As they entered Alexander's office, he felt compelled to ask Elena directly about what he was observing. "Elena, those people were coming to you for operational decisions and strategic guidance. That seems like more than typical assistant responsibilities." Elena set down her materials and turned to face Alexander. "Mr. Sterling, over the years, many of the department heads have gotten comfortable working with me on operational coordination and problem solving. You're often busy with high-level meetings and strategic planning, so they sometimes bring their detailed questions to me." "But Elena, Marcus was asking about supply chain modifications for Asian markets. That's a multi-million-dollar strategic initiative." "Yes, and I coordinate the implementation details while you provide the strategic direction." Alexander was beginning to understand that the distinction between strategic direction and implementation details might not be as clear as he had assumed. It seemed possible that Elena was handling much more of the actual decision-making than he had realized. At 10 a.m., Elena brought him the daily operational reports. But instead of simply handing him documents, she began providing verbal summaries and analysis. "The European facilities are reporting 12% improved efficiency following the workflow modifications we implemented last month," Elena said, consulting her tablet. "However, the London office is experiencing some communication issues with the new protocols, so I've scheduled a video conference with their management team for this afternoon." Alexander stopped her. "Elena, what workflow modifications? I don't remember approving any changes to European operations." Elena looked slightly uncomfortable. "The modifications were recommended by the efficiency consultant we hired to analyze European operations. You approved the consultant's engagement and the implementation budget. But I never reviewed the specific modifications. The consultant's report was included in your weekly briefing materials 3 weeks ago, along with my recommendation to proceed with implementation." Alexander realized that he had approved Elena's recommendation without fully understanding what was being implemented. His weekly briefings included so much detailed information that he often relied on Elena's summaries and recommendations without reviewing the underlying analysis. "Elena, how much operational decision-making have I been delegating to you without realizing it?" Elena chose her words carefully. "Mr. Sterling, you provide strategic direction and final authority for all major decisions. I handle the coordination and implementation details within the parameters you establish." But Alexander was beginning to suspect that the parameters he established were often so broad that Elena was essentially making the actual decisions while he maintained the illusion of control. At noon, Elena escorted Alexander to the conference room for the Henderson merger closing. As they entered the room, Alexander could make out several figures around the table, but his impaired vision made it impossible for him to read facial expressions or review documents in detail. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alexander began, squinting at the papers Elena had placed in front of him, "I'm pleased to finalize this merger that will create significant value for both organizations." What followed was one of the most surreal business meetings of Alexander's career. Every time someone asked a specific question, to rely on Elena to whisper clarifications in his ear. When they needed to review contract clauses, Elena read them to him quietly. When they discussed financial projections, Elena provided the numbers and analysis. But as the meeting progressed, Alexander began to notice something remarkable. Elena wasn't just helping him, she was essentially conducting the meeting. She knew every detail of the deal, understood all the financial implications, could answer complex questions that Alexander himself would have struggled with, and demonstrated a level of expertise that impressed everyone in the room. "Mr. Sterling," said James Henderson, the acquisition target's CEO, "I have to say that Ms. Rodriguez has been exceptional throughout this process. Her understanding of both companies' operations and her ability to find creative solutions to complex integration challenges have been instrumental in making this merger possible." Alexander felt heat rising in his cheeks. "Elena has been very thorough in her support of this acquisition. Indeed, Henderson continued. In fact, I have to admit that Ms. Rodriguez has been our primary point of contact throughout the negotiation process. Her knowledge of the strategic and financial aspects of this deal rivals that of any executive I've worked with. Alexander felt as if the ground was disappearing beneath him. Elena has been your primary contact for a $400 million acquisition. Henderson looked confused by Alexander's surprise. Well, yes. For the past 6 months, we've been working directly with Ms. Rodriguez on structuring the deal, conducting due diligence, and planning the integration process. She's been extraordinarily professional and competent. Elena, sitting beside Alexander, remained calm and composed, but Alexander could sense her tension as her actual role in the merger was being revealed in front of everyone. After the meeting concluded successfully, with Elena handling most of the final details while Alexander signed documents he couldn't read clearly, Alexander asked Elena to accompany him back to his office for a private conversation. Elena, Alexander said, closing his office door and turning to face her, I need you to explain what just happened in there. We successfully completed the Henderson merger acquisition, Elena replied carefully. Elena, James Henderson said you've been his primary contact for 6 months. He said you've been structuring the deal and planning the integration. What exactly have you been doing on this merger? Elena took a deep breath before responding. Mr. Sterling, when the Henderson opportunity first came up, you asked me to handle the initial research and coordination. Over time, as the negotiations became more complex, my role expanded to include managing the due diligence process and maintaining communication with Henderson's team. Expanded how much? I've been coordinating with our legal and financial teams, managing the document review process, developing integration timelines, and serving as the primary liaison with Henderson's management and advisory teams. Alexander felt a mixture of shock, betrayal, and growing realization. Elena, that's not assistant work. That's executive-level responsibility. You've been essentially running a $400 million acquisition. I prefer to think of it as comprehensive administrative support for your strategic leadership of the acquisition. Alexander could see that Elena was trying to maintain the fiction that she had been working under his direction, but the evidence was becoming overwhelming that she had been independently managing complex business operations that he barely understood. Elena, I need you to be completely honest with me. What is your actual role in this company? Elena looked directly at him with an expression that mixed professional composure with years of suppressed frustration. Mr. Sterling, that's a question I've been wondering about myself for quite some time. Over the next few days, as Alexander's vision gradually improved, he began to see Sterling Global with new eyes, literally and figuratively. With Elena serving as his guide and interpreter, he started paying attention to aspects of the company's operations that he had never noticed before, and what he discovered fundamentally challenged his understanding of his own role and importance. Elena, Alexander said Thursday morning, I want you to walk me through a typical day of operations. I want to understand exactly what happens in this company while I'm in meetings and conference calls. Elena consulted her tablet and began what would become one of the most eye-opening conversations of Alexander's professional life. I arrive at 7 a.m. to review overnight reports from our international facilities. The Shanghai office sends production numbers and quality metrics that need to be analyzed and forwarded to the relevant department heads. The London office provides updates on European regulatory developments that might affect our compliance requirements. The Mumbai facility reports on supply chain status and any operational issues that need immediate attention. Alexander was already confused. Elena, why are international facilities reporting to you instead of to their regional managers or to me? They report to their regional managers as well, but I serve as a central coordination point to ensure that information reaches everyone who needs it, and the cross-regional issues are identified and addressed quickly, Elena continued. At 7:30, I have a standing conference call with our European operations to coordinate activities that span multiple time zones. This includes production scheduling, resource allocation, and problem-solving for issues that affect multiple facilities. Elena, stop. You're describing management activities, not administrative support. Elena looked at him calmly. Mr. Sterling, these are coordination activities that ensure smooth operations while you focus on strategic leadership and external relationships. But Alexander was beginning to understand that coordination activities was a euphemism for actually running the day-to-day operations of Sterling Global. Continue, he said, though he was dreading what he might learn. At 8 a.m., I review financial reports from all divisions and prepare summaries for distribution to relevant executives. I also identify any variances from projections that need immediate attention or investigation. Elena, financial analysis is not administrative work. I don't do financial analysis, Mr. Sterling. I review reports prepared by others and highlight items that need attention. Alexander realized that Elena was being modest. Her ability to quickly identify significant issues in complex financial reports required analytical skills that many executives didn't possess. At 9 a.m., I typically meet with department heads who need coordination support or have questions about company policies and procedures. This includes discussions about budget allocations, resource requests, strategic initiative implementation, and problem-solving for operational challenges. Alexander felt increasingly disturbed by what he was hearing. Elena, department heads should be bringing strategic questions to me, not to you. They do bring major strategic questions to you, Mr. Sterling. They bring operational and implementation questions to me because I'm familiar with the details of how our various initiatives and policies are supposed to work in practice. What kind of operational questions? Elena consulted her notes. Yesterday, for example, Marcus from International Operations needed clarification about the new supplier qualification procedures for Asian vendors. Jennifer from Legal had questions about environmental compliance reporting requirements for the European facilities. David from Finance needed coordination with the Mumbai office about currency hedging strategies for the fourth quarter. Alexander realized that each of these operational questions involved complex business decisions that could affect millions of dollars and required substantial expertise to answer correctly. Elena, how do you know about supplier qualification procedures, environmental compliance requirements, and currency hedging strategies? Elena hesitated before responding. I make it my business to understand the various aspects of our operations so that I can provide informed support for your decision-making. But Elena, those are specialized areas that require years of training and experience to understand. I've been working at Sterling Global for 8 years, Mr. Sterling. I've learned a great deal about our business during that time. Alexander was beginning to suspect that Elena had learned more about Sterling Global's business than he had ever realized, and that her informed support was actually informed decision-making that he had been unconsciously delegating to her. Elena, I need to ask you something directly. What is your educational background? Elena looked uncomfortable with the question. Is that relevant to our current situation? Elena, please just answer the question. Elena took a deep breath. I have an MBA from Wharton with concentrations in operations management and international business. Alexander felt as if someone had punched him in the stomach. You have an MBA from Wharton? Elena, Wharton is one of the top business schools in the world. Why didn't I know this? You never asked about my educational background, Mr. Sterling. But Elena, someone with a Wharton MBA doesn't typically work as an executive assistant. Why did you take this job? Elena's professional composure finally showed some cracks. 8 years ago, I needed employment, and this was the opportunity that was available. I thought it would be a temporary position while I looked for management opportunities. But what? But over time, the scope of my responsibilities grew to match my capabilities, and I found that I enjoyed the work and was good at it. Alexander felt a complex mixture of amazement, embarrassment, and something approaching awe. Elena, you're telling me that I've had a Wharton MBA managing my operations for 8 years, and I never realized it? Mr. Sterling, I wouldn't characterize it as managing your operations. I provide comprehensive support for your leadership of the company. But Alexander was finally beginning to see through the diplomatic language that Elena had been using to protect his ego and maintain the fiction that he was in control of Sterling Global. Elena, stop being diplomatic with me. I need to understand what's really been happening here. Have you been essentially running this company while I've been taking credit for your work? Elena was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with how much truth to reveal. Mr. Sterling, Sterling Global is successful because we work as a team. You provide vision, leadership, external relationships, and strategic direction. I handle operational coordination, implementation, and many of the detailed management functions that keep the company running smoothly. But Elena, if you're handling operational coordination and detailed management functions with a Wharton MBA, then you're not an assistant. You're an executive. Elena finally allowed some of her long-suppressed frustration to show. Mr. Sterling, I've been trying to tell you that for years. Alexander felt the world shifting around him as he realized the truth. Elena, when did you last try to discuss your role and responsibilities with me? About 6 months ago, I mentioned that I was interested in taking on more formal management responsibilities and that my current job description didn't reflect the work I was actually doing. Alexander had a vague memory of that conversation. What did I say? Elena's voice became quieter. You said that you valued me too much in my current role to consider promoting me, and that Sterling Global couldn't function without my administrative support. Alexander felt a wave of shame as he realized what he had done. He had essentially trapped an MBA-qualified executive in an assistant's position because her competence in that role made his life easier and reinforced his illusion of being an indispensable leader. Elena, how many times over the years have you tried to discuss your career advancement with me? Several times, Mr. Sterling, but each time you've told me how essential I am in my current position and how you couldn't imagine the company functioning without my administrative support. Alexander realized that he had been unconsciously preventing Elena from advancing because acknowledging her true capabilities would have required acknowledging his dependence on her abilities and intelligence. Elena, I owe you a profound apology. Mr. Sterling, that's not necessary. Yes, it is. Elena, I've been systematically exploiting your capabilities for years. I've been allowing you to do executive-level work while paying you an assistant's salary and giving you none of the recognition or advancement opportunities you deserve. Elena was quiet, but Alexander could see years of suppressed frustration and disappointment in her expression. More than that, Alexander continued, I've been lying to myself about who actually runs this company. I've been taking credit for strategies you developed, decisions you made, and problems you solved. Mr. Sterling, Elena, please let me finish. I need to face this truth. Sterling Global has been successful not because of my leadership, but because of your management. You've been the real chief operating officer of this company, while I've been the figurehead CEO who takes credit for your work. Elena finally allowed herself to show some of the frustration she'd been hiding for years. Mr. Sterling, do you know what it's like to watch someone take credit for your work day after day, year after year? Do you know what it's like to sit in meetings where you present my analysis as your strategic thinking? Do you know what it's like to be introduced as just an assistant to people who know I'm doing executive-level work? Each word hit Alexander like a physical blow. Elena, you're absolutely right to be angry. I've been treating you terribly and I didn't even realize it. I'm not angry, Mr. Sterling. I'm tired. I'm tired of pretending to be less capable than I am so that you can feel more important. I'm tired of hiding my contributions so that you can maintain your image as the irreplaceable genius CEO. Alexander realized that Elena had been managing not just Sterling Global's operations, but also his own ego and insecurities. She had been protecting his self-image while sacrificing her own recognition and advancement. Elena, what would you want? If you could restructure your position and role here, what would it look like? Elena considered the question carefully. I would want to be acknowledged for what I actually am, a senior executive who shares responsibility for this company's operations and success. I would want a title that reflects my actual responsibilities, compensation that reflects my contributions, and recognition for my work rather than watching it be attributed to someone else. Alexander nodded, finally understanding the scope of what he had been doing to Elena and to his own company. Elena, how would you feel about being promoted to Chief Operating Officer? Elena looked stunned. COO? Elena, you've been doing the job of a COO for years. You coordinate all our operations, manage our international activities, oversee our daily management functions, and solve problems at an executive level. The only thing missing has been the title, the compensation, and the recognition. Mr. Sterling, are you serious about this? I'm completely serious. Elena, this week has taught me that what I thought was my assistant is actually my business partner. I want to formalize that relationship and give you the recognition and authority you've earned. Elena was quiet for a long moment. Mr. Sterling, there's something else you should know. What? The board of directors has been aware of my actual role for some time. Several board members have told me privately that they consider me an unofficial executive and that they've been impressed with my performance and knowledge. Alexander felt another wave of embarrassment. The board knows that you've been running operations? Mr. Sterling, when board members ask detailed questions about our operations, and I'm the one who provides comprehensive, knowledgeable answers, they draw their own conclusions about who's actually managing those operations. Alexander realized that everyone except him had understood Elena's true role in the company. He had been the only one maintaining the illusion that she was just an assistant. Elena, will you accept the COO position? Elena smiled for the first time in their conversation. Yes, Mr. Sterling, I will, but I have some conditions. Name them. I want full authority over day-to-day operations. I want to be included in all strategic planning discussions. I want compensation that reflects the market rate for chief operating officers of companies our size. And I want credit for my work and contributions. Alexander nodded. Done. Elena, you've earned all of that and more. As they shook hands, Alexander realized that he was finally beginning to see clearly, not just physically, but professionally and personally. The temporary blindness that had seemed like a disaster had actually been the gift that allowed him to discover the extraordinary talent and capability that had been sitting right outside his office for 8 years. 1 year later, Alexander stood before the board of directors of Sterling Global Enterprises, presenting the most successful annual report in the company's history. But this time, he was not alone at the front of the room. Ladies and gentlemen, Alexander began, I'm pleased to present these record-breaking results alongside my partner, Elena Rodriguez, Chief Operating Officer of Sterling Global Enterprises. Elena stepped forward, carrying herself with the confidence of someone whose capabilities were finally being recognized and utilized. Thank you, Alexander. These results represent the successful implementation of a partnership model that leverages both strategic vision and operational excellence. The numbers were extraordinary. Revenue growth of 34%, profit margins that exceeded industry leaders, successful expansion into 6 new international markets, and employee satisfaction scores that ranked Sterling Global among the top companies to work for in America. Alexander, said Director Morrison, these results are remarkable. Can you explain what changed in your operational model? Alexander looked at Elena with genuine respect and partnership. What changed is that we finally acknowledged and formalized the working relationship that had been driving our success for years. Rather than maintaining the fiction that all authority and capability resided in the CEO position, we created a genuine partnership that recognizes Elena's extraordinary contributions to our company's success. Elena added, we've restructured our leadership model to reflect the reality of how successful companies actually operate, through collaborative leadership that combines strategic vision with operational expertise. Director Chen nodded approvingly. This explains the remarkable improvement in your operational efficiency and decision-making speed. After the meeting, Alexander and Elena walked through the Sterling Global headquarters, which now reflected their partnership in every aspect of its organization. Elena's office was adjacent to Alexander's, with equal space and resources. The organizational chart clearly showed their collaborative leadership structure, and employees throughout the company understood and respected their partnership model. Elena, Alexander said as they reached the executive floor, I need to ask you something I've been thinking about for months. What's that? Do you think I was always unconsciously aware of how much you were doing, or was I genuinely oblivious? Elena considered the question thoughtfully. I think you were aware on some level, but you chose not to examine it too closely because the arrangement worked very well for you. That's not very flattering. Alexander, you're not a bad person. You were just someone who was so focused on maintaining your image as the indispensable CEO that you couldn't see how much you were depending on others. And now? Now you're a better leader because you understand that true strength comes from recognizing and empowering the capabilities of the people around you. That evening, Alexander attended the company's annual recognition dinner, where Elena was being honored as Executive of the Year. As he watched her give her acceptance speech, he reflected on how much his understanding of leadership and partnership had evolved since that day when temporary blindness had forced him to truly see for the first time. A year ago, Elena said to the assembled employees, I was working in a role that didn't reflect my capabilities or contributions. Today, I'm being recognized as an executive, but the truth is that the work I'm being honored for is the same work I was doing before. Elena looked directly at Alexander. The difference is that now we have a leadership structure that acknowledges everyone's contributions and creates opportunities for people to work at their full potential. The applause was thunderous, but Alexander barely heard it. He was thinking about how close he had come to losing the most valuable person in his company simply because he had been too blind to see what was right in front of him. 6 months later, Alexander was invited to speak at the Harvard Business School about innovative leadership models. Standing at the podium where he had once been a student, he prepared to share a story that would have been impossible for him to tell before his experience with temporary blindness. 2 years ago, Alexander began, I was a CEO who believed that successful leadership meant being indispensable. I thought that a strong leader was someone who made all the decisions, controlled all the outcomes, and took credit for all the successes. He looked out at the audience of students, professors, and business leaders. I was also a CEO who was unconsciously exploiting the talents of the most capable person in my organization. Alexander's voice grew stronger as he continued. When temporary blindness forced me to depend completely on my executive assistant, I discovered that the person I had dismissed as support staff was actually a Wharton MBA who had been running the operational side of my company for years. Elena Rodriguez taught me that true leadership isn't about being indispensable. It's about recognizing and empowering the indispensable people around you. A student raised her hand. Mr. Sterling, how did you not know about Ms. Rodriguez's qualifications and capabilities? Because I never asked, and because I made assumptions based on job titles rather than investigating actual capabilities. I was so focused on maintaining my own importance that I couldn't see the extraordinary talent sitting right outside my office. Another student asked, what changed after you promoted her to COO? Alexander smiled. Everything. Our company became more efficient, more profitable, and more innovative. But more importantly, we created a workplace culture where people's contributions are recognized and rewarded based on their actual capabilities rather than their formal titles. What advice would you give to other executives about recognizing hidden talent in their organizations? Pay attention to who actually gets things done, Alexander replied. Look beyond job titles and organizational charts. Ask yourself who you depend on, who solves problems, who makes things happen. Those are your real leaders, whether they have executive titles or not. And what advice would you give to people who feel their capabilities aren't being recognized? Alexander thought of Elena's years of patient competence while being undervalued and underutilized. Be excellent at whatever role you're in, but don't be afraid to advocate for yourself and your capabilities. Sometimes, leaders need to be educated about the talent they already have. After his speech, Alexander was approached by several executives who shared similar stories of discovering that their most valuable employees were not always the ones in the highest positions. As Alexander flew back to New York, he reflected on how a temporary medical crisis had led to permanent insight about leadership, partnership, and the extraordinary people who often work beside us without receiving the recognition they deserve. His phone buzzed with a text from Elena. Saw the video of your Harvard speech. Proud to be your partner. Also, the Tokyo expansion is ahead of schedule and the London office just landed the European Union contract. Alexander smiled and texted back, "Proud to be your partner too. Still learning from the best teacher I've ever had." Elena's response came immediately, "We're both still learning." That's what makes great partnerships work. As the plane flew through the clear evening sky, Alexander thought about the fundamental truth that had taken him far too long to understand. The most valuable people in your organization are often the ones you see every day but never really notice. Sometimes it takes losing your sight to discover that the person sitting right outside your office has been the real leader all along. And sometimes the greatest gift you can receive is the temporary crisis that forces you to see the extraordinary capabilities of the people you've been taking for granted. Sterling Global Enterprises continued to thrive under their partnership model, but more importantly, it became a company where talent was recognized regardless of titles, where contributions were valued regardless of hierarchies, and where the extraordinary people who make success possible finally received the recognition they had always deserved. What do you think? Have you ever worked with someone whose talents were under-recognized? Do you believe that many successful leaders are supported by unsung heroes behind the scenes? Thank you very much for listening. Please let us know what you think of this story in the comments. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss any other videos.